Hello, welcome. Today I'm going to be reading a Choose Your Own Nightmare book. Choose Your Own Nightmare. This is by Edward Packard, and if you've heard that name before, Edward Packard is also responsible for some Choose Your Own Adventure books. These are a couple Choose Your Own Adventure books that I have. I love these style of books. I love anthology. I love going on different adventures. I love that kind of like one thing I love is Mighty Max, where he's kind of taken on different adventures. And I do love horror as well. It's funny, growing up I didn't know I liked horror because a lot of the horror movies that were out at the time weren't things I was into. But of course I was into, Goosebumps. And this is Give Yourself Goosebumps, which is the same style as Choose Your Own Adventure, but it's a Goosebumps book. Goosebumps was late to the game of competition of who's going to make it to print first. They probably, the people at Choose Your Own Adventure probably knew that the solicitation for this was happening. The very first Give Yourself Goosebumps was printed in July of 1995, which is not actually a good time to print a Goosebumps book, but they had to get it out anyway. It's better to have them out in print when kids are in school buying them, talking about them, but the people at Choose Your Own Adventure kind of won out because this is an Edward Packard. This made it to print in March of 95. Who said they were going to do it first? Whatever, it's part of the competitive nature. Choose Your Own Adventure had already existed. Others, copycats existed. I mean, I love Choose Your Own Nightmare as much as I love Give Yourself Goosebumps. As much as I love Choose Your Own Adventure. I just love the idea of sitting and reading and picking. Like, these were books I really got into more than like novels and comic books. Comic books, I'd look at the art. I didn't really read them. These were books I actually read. I mean, I read Goosebumps, but these ones, it really sucked me in, and just, I didn't always do it the way you were kind of like supposed to, which I think is fine. That's kind of the nature of it, is you can kind of read it any way you want to read it. Anyway, this is the number one. This is my copy. Some of the other ones I have from the collection that I've kind of have growing, I've picked up here and there. I was a very early adopter. This is my copy of Choose Your Own Nightmare. It's the first one, Night of the Wereworlf. When it came out, I got it. I wanted it. I got it right away, and so I thought I would read it, and you could all sit and enjoy and see what adventure I go on while I read it. Night of the Wereworlf. Warning. You have probably read books where scary things happen to people. Well, in Choose Your Own Nightmare, you're right in the middle of the action. The scary things are happening to you. So get ready for a vacation you won't forget. Dead bodies, dark nights, and howling, prowling werewolf. Fortunately, while you're reading along, you'll have chances to decide what to do. Whenever you make a decision, turn to the page. Okay, it's giving the instructions. Make sure you choose carefully, or who knows, you may have a werewolf to keep you company. There's some cool art. Neat little art. Doesn't take much, but it adds a little bit. Alright. It's summer vacation, and you're on your way to visit your cousins, Karen and Tom, in their new house. Your Aunt Charlotte is waiting for you at the bus depot. She gives you a big smile and a hug, but she doesn't look happy. You wonder if something's wrong. Later, driving home, she catches your eye. There's something you should know, she says. The police found a body yesterday. It was by a pond only half a mile from our house. Wow, that's terrible. Was it a murder, you ask? They don't know. The victim was covered with deep bites as if he'd been attacked by a dog with huge teeth. But there aren't any dogs like that around here. That's weird, you say, shaking your head. Aunt Charlotte slows down and then turns onto a narrow, winding road. Yes, it is weird, she says, and I've told Karen and Tom, and I'm telling you, be very careful where you go. Stay together and keep your eyes open for trouble. You don't need to tell me, you say, though you're feeling more curious than scared. A few moments later, your aunt swings the car into the driveway and pulls up in the front of the white frame house, half hidden by pine trees. Aunt Charlotte looks over to you. This is what we call home. What do you think of it? Nice, you say. The house looks as if it needs a coat of paint, but it has a screened porch with rocking chairs and a hammock. There's a small upstairs porch, too. A crow is sitting on the railing. It caws loudly as if to make sure you notice it. Your aunt starts into the house. You grab your duffel bag and follow her inside. Karen races down the stairs with Tom right behind her. Hi, Karen says, giving you a hug. The phone is ringing, so Aunt Charlotte goes to answer it. Your cousins show you to the guest room. You throw your duffel bag on the bed and wash up. A few moments later, you join your cousins in the den. Did Mom tell you? Tom asks when you come in. About the murder? Yeah. But also about the suspect, Karen says. No? Did they know who did it? Tom and Karen exchange glances. Not exactly, Karen says. They think it was some weirdo who used to live around here. But your mom said there were big teeth marks. That's what's really weird, Karen exclaims. It's as if the murderer was a werewolf or something. Well, we better investigate this, Tom says. As he's speaking, you notice a fat book on the bookshelf. It's titled Encyclopedia of the Supernatural. The book is very old. You're almost afraid it will crumble in your hands. Carefully, you pull it down from the shelf. You thumb through the book until you reach the letter W. Here. Werewolf, you announce. Tom and Karen crowd around you. What does it say? Tom asks. You read aloud. Werewolf. A person who is changed into a wolf and who begins to look and act like one. No one knows why this happens, but we do know that a werewolf is very strong and very dangerous, especially when it is hungry. Some experts say that a witch can destroy a werewolf. It might even be possible for an ordinary person to overcome one, but it would be very unwise to try. The safest way to deal with a werewolf is to get as far away as possible. This gives me shivers, Karen says. That's all the more reason to check things out, Tom says. I'm going over to Paulding's Pond. That's where they found the body. The police have already been there, Karen says. It won't hurt to go again, her brother replies. We might find something they missed. Well, I'm not going anywhere near that pond, Karen says. I've got a better idea. I'm going to talk to Mrs. Hadley down the road. Maybe she's seen something like this before. That old crazy, Tom scoffs, the old crazy is just the sort of person who knows about werewolves, Karen says calmly. Tom looks at you. Well, I'm going to check out the pond. Want to come? Or you can come with me to talk to Mrs. Hadley, Karen offers. Thinking it might be Karen, but I'm saying it Karen. I'm going to commit to Karen. Karen's, the Elite Four Dark type Pokemon trainer in Gold and Silver who never appeared in the anime. So I think it's supposed to be Karen, but Karen doesn't get enough respect. Well, maybe this old lady's a witch. So instead of witch, I'm going to go with her to page 20. I'm not going to go to the pond. That seems like a dumb idea. I want to hear what Mrs. Hadley has to say, you tell Tom. Come on, Karen, let's go. A few minutes later, you and Karen knock on the door of Mrs. Hadley's house, a tiny cottage perched on a grassy knoll at the edge of the woods. Ooh, she's got to be the witch, come on. I said that, not the book. Anyway, you wait for a minute or so, but there's no answer. And you glance around. The sun is dipping beneath the trees. Long shadows reach out from the woods and cover the ground. She's always home, Karen says. I think she's kind of deaf. She starts banging harder. You knock a couple times yourself. A face appears in the window. A moment later, an old woman with long white hair, a thin face, and piercing blue eyes opens the door. She glares at you and speaks in a harsh, crackly voice. What do you want, children? Making such a racket? We were wondering if you'd seen anything strange around here lately. A weird man or a creature, Karen asks. Mrs. Hadley jerks back, her already wrinkled brow wrinkling even more. What have you seen? She demands. Nothing, Karen says. But the police found a body by Paulding's Pond. There were huge teeth marks on it, like wolf bites, and deep scratches. Mrs. Hadley's jaw drops, her eyes widen, she pulls back a step. A murder? Really? Her eyes seem to be searching beyond for you. I think you'd better come in. There's something you should know. You and Karen follow Mrs. Hadley through her strange little living room. Wooden trunks are stacked along the walls. There's a grandfather clock with no hands, a tiny fireplace that has been sealed away with cement. A door at the back of the living room leads directly to the kitchen. The two rooms seem to take up the whole house. You wonder where Mrs. Hadley sleeps. Well, the old woman tells you to sit at the table and brings over a pot of tea from the counter. After pouring the tea, she sits down across from you, eyeing you over the rim of her cup as she drinks. The tea has an odd smell to it, like water in the bottom of a vase of dead flowers. If there's one thing kids love, it's tea that smells like dead flowers. Now, where shall we begin? Mrs. Hadley says. I had never expected to talk about this, but I think this is time. She narrows her eyes and purses her lips, staring at you so hard you shrink back in your chair. Years ago, she says, there was a man who lived in the woods behind your house, Karen. There was a shack back there. Everyone assumed he lived in it, but almost no one ever saw him. Did you ever see him, you ask? She nods, pouring more of the smelly tea into her cup. Only once. He had a short, ragged beard, bristly hair, and pointed face with a long, thick nose that seemed to join with his chin. How was there room for his mouth? Asks Karen. Oh, he had a mouth, all right, Mrs. Hadley says, her voice rising, and jaws. That's what I remember most. I was in my garden, and I saw him staring at me through the woods. He looked at me as if I were a slab of steak on his plate. I didn't like it, and I thought, someday he'll learn not to look at me like that. She leans closer. You see, children, I was already beginning to learn about my special powers. Hearing this strange talk, you remember how Tom said Mrs. Hadley was crazy. Who owned our house then? Karen asks. Mr. Roger Cranmore. And as she says this, a Siamese cat leaps up on the table and looks at you with cold, blue-gray eyes. Did you know Mr. Cranmore? You ask. Very slightly. He traveled a great deal, says Mrs. Hadley, stroking her cat. He was murdered right in his own bed. Karen's eyes widen. His body was found by the police after he didn't show up to work. Mrs. Hadley continues. Mrs. Hadley pauses for a minute. But you were just children. I wouldn't want to describe what he looked like. Tell us, Karen says. We're old enough. You probably don't know what we see on TV, you add. Or the internet. She gives you an odd, quick smile. All right, I'll tell you, if you really want to know. His neck and shoulders were raked by claws, as if some kind of animal, Karen gasps, like the body they found at the pond. Which is just what you were thinking. Did they catch the murderer, you ask? Mrs. Hadley shakes her head. They combed the woods for him, and they searched the shack where the man with the pointed face lived. And it were bones, rabbits and dogs, and even human? You put in, yes? Human. She smiles as if she likes the idea. This was no ordinary murderer, she declares. This was a werewolf. Oh, you say? And now he's come back for another meal, Karen adds. Maybe more than one, you think? Gosh, you must have been scared, Karen says. A thin smile forms on Mrs. Hadley's lips, but instead of making her look friendly, it makes her look frightening. Yes, I was scared, out of my wits, she says, raising her voice. That's why I don't have any wits. But even though I lost my wits, I gained something else. There are many things I can do, my little sweets, things you'd never dream of. Karen looks alarmed. We'd better get on home, she says nervously. You glance out the window. Dark clouds are blotting out the last of the light. Yes, you'd better get home, Mrs. Hadley says. And if you're smart, you won't go out alone around here, especially after dark. There's a tone to her voice and a look in her eyes that send a chill through you. You don't want to seem chicken, but you're thinking it might be a good idea to call up Aunt Charlotte and ask her to come pick you up. Maybe you should get Karen to call her. If you tell Karen she better call her mom and ask you to pick her up, turn to page 26. If you decide to just walk home, turn to page 11. Well, why would I think to ask and then not do it? I think I'll ask to be picked up. Karen reaches her mother on the phone, and a few minutes later she comes to get you. On the way home, you tell her what Mrs. Hadley said, and she laughs. A werewolf? Ridiculous. Ellen Hadley is getting crazier every year, making up a story like that, trying to scare you. She should be ashamed of herself, except I'm sure she can't help it. She's always been a strange woman, and I guess the older she gets, the stranger she gets. Aunt Charlotte turns into the driveway and pulls to stop. You and Karen follow her into the house. Tom, she calls. There's no answer. He went down to Paulding's pond, where they found the body, Karen says. Guess he's not back yet. A startled look comes over your aunt's face, as if she believes in werewolves after all. Well, it's getting quite dark, and it can rain any minute, she says. And I don't want Tom hanging around where such terrible crime was committed. But you live in America. Anyway, I'm going down there to find him. I'll be back soon. Meanwhile, you two stay put. She heads out the door. A moment later, you hear her car pulling out of the driveway. The house seems strangely silent. You stand at the kitchen window looking out. Storm clouds fill the sky, but for a moment, the moon appears. Hanging low over the treetops before disappearing behind another cloud. You're about to turn away when you hear a howl. Not the howl of a dog, but a great, long, wailing sound. Suddenly, Karen is next to you, her hand on your shoulder. What was that? She says nervously. I don't know, you say. It sounds like a wolf. Again, you hear the howl, this time closer. A moment later, there was a flash of lightning, quickly followed by a tremendous clap of thunder. Hard rain begins to fall. Another flash, the lights flickering on and off, and then on again. A moment later, you're startled by a violent pounding on the front door. You and Karen run upstairs to her bedroom and look out the window. Even though it's pretty dark, you still have a good view of the front door. Whoever was knocking has disappeared. Again the howl comes, this time from inside the house. Karen clutches your arm. We must have left the door unlocked. Even as she speaks, you hear a pat, pat, pat on the stairs. It's not the sound of shoes. It's the sound of padded feet. We've got to barricade the door, Karen says. Help me move my bed in front of it. From the top of the stairs. The bed may not stop it, you scream. We can shimmy down the tree outside the window. It's too far to jump. Help me, Karen starts tugging at her bed frame, but she's not strong enough to move it by herself. If you help Karen barricade the door, turn to page 32. If you insist on leaping to the tree, turn to page 13. Well, I feel like we can try barricading the door and then still maybe go out the window. So let's go to 32. Quickly, you help Karen pull one end of the bed away from the wall. Then you run around behind it. The two of you start pushing. From the hallway comes a noise. Not a howl, but a deep, throaty growl. Then footsteps. They stop right outside the door. With a final shove, you and Karen jam the bed in between the door and the corner of the closet. A second later, there's a great thump on the door. Then another. And another. And another. Then a furious roar. Thump. The latch breaks. The door springs open a few inches and jams against the bed. You see the dark nose, furry snout, and jaws of a werewolf. Then it backs up. Thump, thump, thump. You and Karen cringe in the corner, watching the door bang against the bed frame. The werewolf is getting really angry. It stops for a moment. You hear the werewolf pounding, growling in the hallway. Then he smashes the door so hard it splits the wood of the bed frame. The crack in the door opens wider. Another tremendous smash. The wood splits even more. He's going to get in, you yell to Karen. We've got to get down the tree. She quickly climbs up onto the windowsill, but then she freezes. There's a 2-foot wide gap between the window and the tree. It's still pouring. Lightning flashes. Thunder rumbles across the sky. You can make it, you cry. Get your arms and legs around the tree trunk. You can shimmy down. With a little shriek, she jumps. She grabs the tree just right and starts to shimmy down to the ground. You quickly climb up the windowsill. Behind you, there's a terrible crunch. The bed frame gives way. The door flies open. You look over your shoulder. A grisly, hulking figure is coming at you. Its jaws open, its long tongue curling over its sharp, curved teeth. You fling yourself into the air and hit the tree hard, smashing your nose. You manage to get your arms and legs around the tree trunk. From there, it's only a second or two of shimmying down and then a 3-foot drop to the ground. You almost hit Karen, who is just getting to her feet. Ooh, one picture. Off to page 40. Headlights are shining up the driveway, and Charlotte is back, and Tom is with her. Karen reaches the car. She pulls open the back door and dives in. You're right behind her. Aunt Charlotte laughs. Hey, we're not going anyplace. We have to, Karen says, shaking. You've got a bloody nose. Her mother interrupts, staring at you. She hands you some tissues. What's going on? Look, Tom yells as the flash of lightning lights up the sky. Oh my lord, Aunt Charlotte cries. You all watch in horror as the werewolf lops through the shadows at the side of the house. Then it is dark again. A moment later, you hear a long, wailing howl. All the way back to page 6. Mom, he was in the house, Karen cries, trying to get in my room. We had to jump out of the window. She's leaning forward against the back of Tom's seat. Aunt Charlotte half turns and gives her a quick hug. It's okay now, honey. And she slams the car into reverse, backs out of the driveway, and races down the road. Where are we going to? Tom asks. To the police station. Where else? Aunt Charlotte says and turns the corner so fast that your seatbelt only keeps you from being thrown against the door. An hour later, you are back at Aunt Charlotte's house, this time with policemen. The storm has passed, the state police have been called in, and troopers are combing the area, looking for a strange intruder. With Aunt Charlotte and your cousins, you lead the policeman up and show him Karen's room. The door that the werewolf forced open is scuffed and dented. Karen's bed frame is split down its entire length. The policeman shakes his head. We'll get him, ma'am. You can be sure of that. I'm not sure it's a him, Aunt Charlotte says. From what the kids say, it may be an it. The policeman squints at her a moment. Well, whether it's a him or an it, the chief thinks he might come back. He wants me to spend the night here and keep an eye on things. Meanwhile, don't anyone go into this room. The detective will be here in the morning to go over fingerprints. And claw prints, you think? You can sleep on the daybed in the spare room, Aunt Charlotte says to Karen. She puts her arm around her. We'll get your room fixed up, honey, she says. The policeman sits in the kitchen drinking coffee. The rest of you gather in the living room and talk about what happened. Aunt Charlotte picks up the phone and dials a number. After a few moments, she hangs up looking concerned. I thought I'd call Mrs. Hadley and tell her to lock up extra tight, but there's no answer. She probably went out, Tom says. Out? I don't think she goes out at night, his mother replies. She calls again. This time when she hangs up, she's clearly angry. I told the police they should send over someone to guard Mrs. Hadley. They said they had no one available, and they can't provide a guard for everyone in town. Well, that makes sense, you say. Yes, your aunt says, but Mrs. Hadley is old and lives alone. Something must have happened, or she would have answered. I'm going over there to make sure she's all right. Mom, you shouldn't go out, Tom says. I'm going, she says. You kids can either come with me, or you can stay here with the policeman. Off to 74. I'll come, Tom says. I've got to protect you. All right, Tom. I'll come protect you too, Karen says. Aunt Charlotte grins. She touches your shoulder. Do you want to come, or would you rather stay here with the policeman? I mean, if everyone else is going, if you say you'll go, page 20, if you stay in the house. Everyone else is going, I guess I'll go to page 27. I don't want to miss anything. I'll come along, you say. You, Tom, and Karen all pile into the car. A few minutes later, Aunt Charlotte pulls up in front of Mrs. Hadley's cottage. There's only a single dim light coming from the kitchen. You kids better stay in the car and lock it, Aunt Charlotte says. No way, Tom replies. He opens the door and hops out. Just as fast, you and Karen are out on the other side. All right, Aunt Charlotte says. Just stay together and stay close to me. You all follow her up to the front door. She bangs loudly. There's no answer. She's kind of deaf, Tom says. Maybe she's afraid to open it, you say. Mrs. Hadley, Aunt Charlotte yells, rapping again. Let's look into the kitchen window. That's the only room with a light on, you say. Follow me, Aunt Charlotte says. The four of you start around the corner of the house. Who is that? A voice screams. It's coming from one of the windows. It's Charlotte from down the road, your aunt calls. Wanted to make sure you were all right. Well, you shouldn't be snooping around, Miss Hadley says. I'm sorry, Aunt Charlotte says. A little annoyed. I didn't mean. Mrs. Hadley cuts her off. What were you worried about? Come around to the kitchen door if you were so suspicious. A few seconds later, she lets you all in. Now, what's this about making sure I'm all right, she demands. She's holding a cup of tea, which she waves angrily as she talks. None of you answer. You're staring at a creature stretched out on the floor. It has a shaggy coat of hair. Its hands and feet are padded paws. Its face is long and pointed, and its nose is round, black, and moist. The creature's long mouth is half open, revealing long, sharp-pointed teeth. It's a werewolf. Oh, is that all? Just a werewolf in the middle of the kitchen? How did this happen, you wonder? It's the strangest sight you ever saw. But even stranger, the werewolf is dissolving in front of your eyes. Its snout is shriveling. Its shaggy coat is shrinking. It's as if the flesh and bones underneath were disappearing into thin air. Then the creature's skin vanishes, leaving a thick pattern of coarse, bristly hairs on the floor, forming the outline of the body that is no longer there. This can't be happening. You must be dreaming. But then you remember reading in the encyclopedia about what can destroy a werewolf. You look over to Mrs. Hadley. She has a wild look in her eyes. She rubs her hands. Her cat suddenly jumps on her shoulder. It stares at you coldly. Yeah, maybe Miss Hadley is a witch after all. What have you done? Aunt Charlotte stammers. How? You start to say, as the old woman comes over and takes her chin, cradling it in her gnarled, wrinkled hand. Her hand is damp and very cold. A chill goes through your whole body. You start to shiver. She lets go, but you can't stop shivering. Tom is shivering too. Aunt Charlotte is staring at the bristly hairs on the floor. She can't seem to move. You look cold, dear, Mrs. Hadley says to you. Why don't you have some tea before you leave? No, you say loudly. The woman shakes at Aunt Charlotte's shoulder. You're not frightened, are you, my dear? And to think you were worried about me. She burst into a wild, cackling laugh. Yes, we were, Aunt Charlotte says. We thought... Her voice trails out. We thought you point at the floor, but you can't finish your sentence. I guess there was nothing to worry about, Aunt Charlotte says. Mrs. Hadley's eyes are flashing, reflecting in the light like the eyes of her cat. She reaches for the teapot and pours more tea. A bitter smell enters your nostrils, giving you a weird, sickly feeling, like nothing you've known. No, there was nothing to worry about, the old woman says in a slow, deliberate tone. The night of the werewolf has passed. But don't think you are safe now that what? He blurted out. But before you get an answer, Aunt Charlotte leaps to her feet, steps over to the door, and opens it. She breathes deeply from the fresh air blowing in. Turning, she says, Come on, children. Good night, Mrs. Hadley. That what, Mrs. Hadley, you ask again? That you've learned my secret, the woman cries. Her mouth forms a thin, cruel smile. Her eyes hold you tightly. Her gnarled hand reaches out toward you. But Aunt Charlotte is pulling at your arm. She motions to Karen and Tom. The three of you are all quickly out the door. Thank you for stopping by, Mrs. Hadley calls after you. Next time, I'll come and visit you. Her wild, cackling laugh rings in your ears as you hurry back to the car. You all scramble in. Aunt Charlotte starts the engine. I can't believe what we just saw, Tom says. And what we heard, you add. Aunt Charlotte puts the car in gear and pulls away. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself, she says. I still can't believe it, you say. The werewolf's body on the floor, the way it just disappeared. I don't know if I feel any better or worse, Karen says. I think you should feel better, her mother tells her. We don't have to worry about a werewolf anymore. That's true, you say. Now we can start worrying about a witch. The end. That was Night of the Werewolf by Edward Packard, a choose your own nightmare. I chose my own nightmare there. Interesting. I'm glad I got to the witch ending. Witch ending? The witch ending. Well, thank you for joining me on this choose your own nightmare reading. That was really cool. Maybe I'll have to do a choose your own adventure. That was a Packard story, inside UFO 5440, or your code name is Jonah. This looks like interesting stuff here. Ooh. I'll have to do a live reading at some point, I think, so I can get people to help out with the choices. Interesting turnout. The witch won. Thank you for joining me.